This is your PowerPoint for the second unit on economics, talking about how capitalism evolved from the late 1800s up until World War II. So during the Second Industrial Revolution, the United States took off in competition with other countries when it came to industry and the development of the country towards industry. The reason why I call this the Second Industrial Revolution is that really the Industrial Revolution began in America probably around the 1830s. But we're going to see a Second Industrial Revolution as far more complex and far larger. And this takes place largely because of a technological boom that was due to what was called the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process was taken from England and applied in the United States. The Bessemer process took minerals, melded them together, and then you would blow cold air onto this hot melding process, and that created steel. Steel was probably the most durable man-made metal at this time period. It was the most durable and had the fewest impurities, and this allowed for the development of so many other things in society at the time, such as the potential for railroads, tenement apartments, and factories. And because of this, this led to being a magnet for people to come over from other countries, especially Southern and Eastern Europe, in order to create a massive growth in urbanization. It also connected up Pennsylvania to the East Coast, and this becomes very important because that Ohio River Valley that had always been so important for agriculture now took on another importance. The Pennsylvania region became important because there were so many minerals that were there that could be extracted and then brought over to the East Coast, and you could use this Bessemer process in order to meld them down and to form steel. Eventually, this created this new industrial process that also led to something that a lot of economists have noted, conservative or liberal, and they've noted that there is something called a business cycle within capitalism. The idea of the business cycle is this: about every 10 years, there will be a boom and bust cycle. So the first part of the cycle is a boom cycle, and that's based upon technological innovation. So for example, we have the Bessemer process. The Bessemer process allows for a massive growth in the economy, and this creates what's known as a boom cycle. Eventually, there will be a contraction, though. Eventually, there will be a bust cycle where the economy will collapse. Now, overall, most economists would argue that this is just a natural part of the economy. And the question is, okay, well, what exactly causes this? And there's been an argument for a long time about what exactly causes it. One possible cause is that as the economy grows, the economy becomes inflated. As more and more people start to buy up things, prices will go higher and higher. And once prices reach a certain level, people can no longer buy the goods that are there. This is known as a cost push inflation. In the case of a cost push inflation, what ends up happening is people just can't buy the products that are there anymore, and so products remain on the shelf. And when that happens, businesses at that point cut back, and when they do, it creates a bust cycle. Eventually, though, what will happen is the economy moves back to what we call a state of equilibrium, meaning that once the economy hits this bust cycle, you will eventually have the economy move back to a state that is more normal. And for classical economists, they believe that the economy itself can do this. It's what's called self-correcting. Classical economists argue that when the market it has these kinds of boom and bust cycles, it just corrects itself. So for example, let's say that the economy goes through a recession. Businesses lay off people, and that means people have less purchasing power. When people have less purchasing power, prices have to come down. And at that point, people can start affording things again, and the market can get going again. That's the idea of the classical notion of the business cycle. So who are these classical economists? Well, classical economists go back to the founder of capitalism itself, which is Adam Smith. And Adam Smith argued that there is a natural state to human behavior and that it really is based upon supply and demand. So there's a lot more complexity to Adam Smith's ideas, but the overall idea that Adam Smith argued for was that supply and demand interact with each other, and that creates these business cycles, and they will eventually balance each other out as well. Another classical economist was somebody named Jean-Baptiste Say. Say argued that supply basically creates its own demand. Well, how is that possible? It sounds kind of abstract. Well, you can imagine it on a very specific level. Let's say that we want to supply people with any type of commodity. Take, for example, at this time period, we want to supply people with a new booming industry like automobiles. Well, so we go out and we start to create automobiles, right? So eventually the Model T Ford is going to get created. Well, in order to create the Model T Ford, you have to have people actually working on the assembly line to create it. And that means they're getting paid. But what are they going to do with all that money that they make? Well, they're going to go out and demand products. And one of the products they're going to want to demand is the very thing they made, the Model T car. So in other words, according to classical economists, supply creates its own demand. Another classical economist is David Ricardo. Ricardo is going to argue about international affairs, and this is going to be very important, especially when we get into the later parts of the class with what's happened since World War II. Ricardo is going to make the argument of what's called comparative advantage. So we look at countries here, and countries are a lot of times unequal in their trading relationships. So does that mean that that is what's called a zero-sum game in economics? No, not at all. Take, for example, the United States and Mexico. Nobody would argue that the United States and Mexico are equal economically. We know that the American dollar is much stronger than the Mexican currency. But David Ricardo would argue that here's what both countries can do. Both countries focus on what they're good at, what they are comparatively good at, what they have a comparative advantage on. The United States is very good at making and selling software. The Mexican economy is very good at making and servicing automobiles. So you basically have both of those countries working together in trade at what they are good at, and that allows them then to start storing up wealth so that they can invest for the future. In other words, Ricardo would argue that even though there are inequalities, those inequalities can be used by different countries in trade in order to better their economies. Notice what the classical economist argument is overall. Their argument is that the economy itself creates its own equilibrium through competition. So now let's get back to the history of this and see actually how things developed. Abraham Lincoln, who was a capitalist, still believed that the government had a pretty specific role in trying to mold and sort of guide capitalism into an industrial economy. And so Lincoln and the future Republicans during the Civil War provided things to the economy to make this happen. For example, they provided land grants to railroads. The North Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the Southern Pacific Railroad. All of these railroads were given land grants by the federal government in order to make sure that this would develop a national transportation system. Lincoln also provided at this time period homestead grants to provide incentives for people to move out west. Now this sounds like a very farming kind of move, right? We're providing farmers the chance to move out west, but that was not Lincoln's goal. Lincoln's goal was to provide homestead grants so that people could move out west near cities where railroads would pass through, and eventually this would attract people into the cities, and this would develop more and more industrialized competition throughout the country. Also, Lincoln and the Republicans provided the Morrill Land Grant, which provided grants for the development of technical colleges at this time. So look at what Lincoln's doing here. Lincoln's overall idea of government getting involved in the economy is to provide guidance so that the economy will eventually develop into an industrialized economy. In the late 1800s, we started to see a process of the monopolization of the market. So the business cycle saw dramatic contractions and expansions in the late 1800s. And for a lot of economists, remember, classical economists at this time period believed the economy was self-correcting, and overall it was. But there was a lot of concern at this time period at the dramatic types of contractions and expansions that were occurring. For example, there was a panic in 1873, and there was another panic in 1893, or recessions. The leaders of industry feared at this time that the market really needed organization. So because of that, they started to organize the economy through forms of integration or monopolization, such as vertical, horizontal, and interlocking directorates. And you might remember we've talked about this a little bit before. Vertical was done by Carnegie. That's where he bought up all the process in order to make steel. Horizontal was when John Rockefeller went out and bought up all of his competition in the oil market. Interlocking directorates was done by J.P. Morgan. He would go out in the banking industry and he would put people onto local banks. He would offer them loans, and in contribution to those loans, people would then have to sit on the boards of directors of these banks, and that way he could really kind of influence the decisions of all these banks. And at this time period, currency was backed up by gold, and the major fear of banks was always that currency, if it became too easy, would lead to inflation in the economy. And so this allowed J.P. Morgan to really make decisions for a lot of banks about how much currency could go out into society. So on the opposite side, workers had their own complaints about the way things were going. Workers complained at this time period that they were receiving low wages. Typically at this time period, Men were receiving about $6 per week for working about 17 to 19 hours per day. Women earned half of that, $3, and then children half of that at $1.50 per week. They also complained about poor working conditions, and they complained about the long hours. Another major complaint came from the middle class, and a good example of this was Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was a part of a group of writers called the Muckrakers, and she argued that John Rockefeller had been using unfair tactics in competition. So, for example, John Rockefeller didn't just buy out other industries. He would have people that he would hire who would go out and pose as if they were looking for jobs in the oil industry, and they would do things like industrial espionage, where they would go into an industry that was competing with John Rockefeller, and when nobody was watching, they would actually sabotage the materials and machinery in a competing industry. He also had what were called industrial spies who would go out and actually try to spy on other industries and gain their tactics and information so that John Rockefeller could buy them out. And he used something called rebates. He would go to a local railroad and tell them that he would provide a rebate to them for production going back and forth. But in order to do this, the railroad would have to promise that they would not transport oil for any of John Rockefeller's competitors. This made things so expensive for John Rockefeller's competitors that at some point they would just drop out and they would sell their industry to him. Ida Tarbell complained about this. Her father was actually an oil leader at the time period, and he had been taken over by John Rockefeller, and this caused such a massive psychological loss for him that Ida Tarbell's dad died of a nervous breakdown. So Tarbell actually criticized John Rockefeller. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court eventually found Rockefeller's tactics to be unfair competition, and they broke down Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's oil industry, into numerous different smaller oil industries, which actually today, when you go around, all the gas stations you see used to be a part of John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Workers were also angry at this time period for the violent tactics used by many of the leaders of industry. Andrew Carnegie, for example, in the Homestead strike, used the Pinckney Detective Agency to go after union leaders, and they would actually use pretty violent tactics. For example, oftentimes the Pinckney Detective Agency would go out, and most strikes took place out where these homestead factories were out in the hills. They would actually set up in the hills, and they would be snipers, where they would actually kill union leaders by sniping at them from far off. So, who were these unions and what was their alternative? Well, there were three major unions that are a good example of the different alternatives that the unions provided. Overall, the union alternative was the idea of collective bargaining. Workers would join together and they would, as a group, bargain through their leadership with the owners of industry. If the owners of industry would not bargain, then at that point, laborers could always go on strike and stop production. There were three good examples of this. There was the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, led by a man named Samuel Gompers, who wanted what was known as bread and butter issues. He wanted a minimum wage and maximum working hours. Maximum working hours at first were 12 hours and then eventually went down to 8 hours. Samuel Gompers started off actually as a socialist, but then rejected socialism and looked for sort of a middle ground between laissez-faire capitalism and socialism. Another example were the Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor were a little bit more radical. They were led by a man named Terence Powderly. He argued that the best way that a union would have power was to integrate that union, both by race and by skill level. He wanted to see a large union that could collectively bargain and have power in dealing with major owners. And then there was the most radical, the IWW, or the International Workers of the World, oftentimes called the Wobblies. The Wobblies were led by a man named Big Bill Hayward, and he was known to be radical. And he was radical because he believed the only way you could actually change the problems for workers was not to tinker around with capitalism, but to change it completely and move to a much different type of society that was either socialist or anarchist. So, some significant events in the late 1800s that would influence the way people looked at things. One was the Homestead Strike. In the case of the Homestead Strike, workers struck against Andrew Carnegie's factory out in Pennsylvania, and the governor of Pennsylvania was actually eventually called in to put down the strike with the state militia. In the late 1800s, after the recession of 1893 that took place, there was the Pullman strike, in which President Cleveland eventually sent in the military to stop the strike of railroad car workers, claiming that they were stopping the process of information. And then there was the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair took place in Chicago. In Chicago, there's a place called the Haymarket, and that's where people go and kind of do like a farmer's market, or they sell goods. And at one point, union leaders came together, and they were having a huge rally, and a bomb went off and killed several policemen during that time period. So they rounded up all the union leaders and claimed that many of them were anarchists, put them on trial, and then said that they were going to be convicted and killed. Several of them were eventually hung, but the rest remained in prison for the next 10 years until the Illinois governor, John Altgeld, looked at the evidence that had been used during the trial and came to the conclusion that this trial really was not based upon evidence, but was based upon prejudices against the union leaders. So what did all this come to? Well, for workers, the main conclusion this came down to was that the government was not truly laissez-faire, that the government was on the side of industrial owners, and that this government was very prejudiced towards people in the unions because they were new immigrants. So the reason why this becomes so important is that Americans started moving much more towards a union mindset. Now, one of the big questions is, why didn't Americans ever decide to adopt socialism as a possible alternative? In Europe, they were doing that, but Americans never did. And so we end up in America really with two major possibilities, either moving towards laissez-faire or moving towards a union possibility in solving workers' problems. At the same time, there was another movement that was taking place, and it was taking place amongst farmers. Farmers faced a problem called overproduction, in which they would produce more, which is normal for capitalism, but by doing that, that would lower the price. And as they continued to produce more in order to solve the problem, to mass produce, the price would just keep getting lower and lower in the goods. They could not bring in enough currency. So the farmers ended up forming a number of movements. One was to regulate railroads. They felt that railroad prices were too high, and so through a movement called the Grange Movement, they attempted to solve this problem. Farmers also tried to create what are known as cooperatives in order to share production costs. But probably the most successful and the biggest movement of all were the populists. The populists argued that the real problem was currency, that there needed to be more currency in the economy to artificially inflate the economy. And this was known as bimetallism, to base the currency on not just gold, but gold and silver. So all of these movements really didn't have too much of an effect in the late 1800s, but the reason why they eventually became successful was that they kind of all moved together in a watershed moment to form the Progressives of the early 1900s. So the Progressives had like I was saying here, they had really been brewing since the late 1800s, and probably the tipping point that really pushes them over was a group of journalists called the Muckrakers, who pointed out the major problems that had been brewing since the late 1800s. We talked about Ida Tarbell and her criticism of monopolies by Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Another major muckraker was a man named Lincoln Steffens, who criticized the poor housing conditions in cities. And then there was David Graham Phillips, who criticized business for having too much influence at the time over the Senate. But probably the biggest influence came from a man named Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. He criticized the meat packing practices at that time period. Now, Sinclair's book, The Jungle, actually was about all the different industrial practices at the time, but the biggest impact came out of his description of how horrible meat packing practices at that time were. And his book eventually had such a great influence that it actually influenced Teddy Roosevelt, the first progressive president, to really push for a lot of government regulations over business. And then there was Jacob Riis, who wrote one of the most famous books of the time called How the Other Half Lives, in which he talked about two different communities, the immigrant community and the middle-class community. He said, if you live in the middle-class community, America looks great, and you go around and live your daily life and everything seems fine. But if you just go a few blocks down, you can actually go down to the tenement apartments in New York, and you can see how difficult it is for immigrants in the way that they are living in the country. All of these ideas came together and had a huge influence in the media over the way the country was being run. And progressives then took off in a different way of understanding how the economy should be run. So that leads to Teddy Roosevelt. We have two major progressive presidents. Teddy Roosevelt was the first, and like I said, he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and that really changed his mind. Up until this time, Roosevelt really was against the progressives. He even called the muckrakers. He's the one who gave them their name, and he said, the muckrakers are these people who all they ever do is look at the bad stuff in America. They rake up the muck of America, and this is where we ended up having this idea. So Teddy Roosevelt comes up with a program called the 3 C's. And in the 3 C's, he promotes consumer protections, corporate control, meaning government breakdown of monopolies, and conservation, the protection of the environment for future use. He also passed the first minimum wage, And he passed a number of laws, such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, which provided information for the safety of consumer goods, the Hepburn Act, that set standardized rates for farmers on railroads. And he even was the first president to come in mediating on the side of unions in the case of the anthracite coal strike. What's important about Teddy Roosevelt is that we see his mindset here as being sort of this regulation of capitalism and sort of a guidance of capitalism in order to make it more, in his mind, efficient and fair. Sort of the similarity here would be going back to somebody like an Alexander Hamilton. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson comes in after Teddy Roosevelt, and Wilson is our second progressive president, very similar in many ways, but actually there's a fundamental difference between the two men. Woodrow Wilson believed that all large organizations hurt the character of America, whether it's government, business, or unions. He favored sort of small organizations, and if you notice here, he's very much like the Jeffersonian beliefs. Now, Wilson didn't believe we should go back to being an agricultural country, but he did believe that Jeffersonian's farming belief could be transferred over to small businesses. Wilson's overall program was to break down large businesses, banks, governments, and unions, and to provide more competition in the country. So how did he want to do this? Well, one thing he did was to pass something called the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act stopped price discrimination and interlocking directorates. The first time that we see an attempt to do this is something known as the Sherman Antitrust Act in the late 1800s. Sherman Antitrust Act tried to break down monopolies, but the Supreme Court eventually ruled that what the Sherman Antitrust Act really meant was breaking down unions or worker monopolies. So Wilson here turns around and provides the Clayton Antitrust Act to really push much more for business monopolies to be broken down. Wilson also, at this time period, began lowering tariffs under the Underwood Tariff. The reason for doing this, according to Wilson, was to provide more international competition. You know, at the beginning of the country, maybe it was good for us to have tariffs to protect small businesses. But now these businesses had grown into these industrial giants, and the best way to break them down was through international competition. Wilson also amended the Constitution with the 16th Amendment, or the progressive income tax. Progressive income tax basically taxes people at higher rates as they move up higher in their income. Now, what would be the purpose of doing this? Well, the idea behind this really is to stop the concentration of wealth in the wealthiest of classes. When people gain more and more wealth, they not only have that wealth, they then go out and try to influence government to keep that wealth. So Wilson's idea here was to break down some of that wealth concentration so that there would not be as much influence by the upper class onto government, and by doing this, you could then have smaller organizations. But probably the biggest thing that Wilson is going to do, and one of the most controversial today, is the Federal Reserve Act. The purpose was to try to stop monopolies within the private sector of banking. He created what's called the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is not entirely a government organization. It was not intended to be. In other countries it is, but in our country, the Federal Reserve is both governmental and private. It controls what we call the elastic flow of money into the economy, or elastic flow of currency into the economy. So the idea is this: Federal Reserve either puts money in or takes money out of the economy in order to control inflation or deflation. And his point of doing this was to remove overall monopolies by individuals like J.P. Morgan. So eventually, after World War I was done, we saw a huge boom in the economy. And just like we talked about earlier, this new business cycle was probably due to the expansion of huge technologies like movies and the radio, the icebox in order to refrigerate items, the Model T, and the airplane. Also, there was a huge demographic shift at this time period in the suburbs. Now, how did people do this? Well, from about 1923 up until 1926, people did this because they had increasing incomes. But from 1926 to 1929, people's incomes actually stagnated. So the reason why they were able to do this had to do with credit. For example, in the stock market, people did a process called buying on the margin, where they would put down 10% and then borrow the other 90%. Also, they used something called installment payments, where when they went in to buy a commodity, like for example a couch, they would put down a certain amount of money each month and borrow, basically, in order to buy off that good. Now, credit can be a very good thing. By doing this, people could buy more goods and you would have more flow of money in the economy. But there was going to be a huge disadvantage to this, and that is the crash of 1929. Like I said, from 26 to 29, real wages slowed, leading to more buying on credit. Now here's where the problem really comes in. We had more and more speculation on the stock market, We had people buying things on credit. And the problem was there wasn't enough currency in the economy to really back this up. And so we got to 1929, and the Federal Reserve noticed that there was a massive growth within the stock market, and they feared that once this crashed, this would lead to a massive crash within society. So they tried to slow it down. They used a tool that they have to slow down the growth, which is rising interest rates. But what happened was investors took their money and they just invested abroad. And so this caused a major crash on the stock market. Now, what the Federal Reserve should have done at this point is the Federal Reserve should have created a massive amount of currency within banks to try and save them from any types of runs on the banks. Instead, the Federal Reserve got fearful and pulled back and decided that their fear was if they allowed for too much money into the economy, it would create inflation. So they would not provide money to the banks, and that meant banks were incredibly vulnerable, and there were runs on the banks to try and get people's money because of the fear of what had happened in the stock market. So in the 1920s, we had seen at this time period 3 presidents who all favored a laissez-faire approach: Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. So when Hoover was in office and the Great Depression began, he tried to intervene. He actually was not completely laissez-faire. He created something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. That provided government aid through loans to businesses, but the problem was the loans were so small in scope they really didn't do much to try and solve the problem. The Federal Reserve tried to tighten up the currency supply in fear of inflation, and this led to a massive contraction in the economy from 1928 to 1932. So the new president that came in was Franklin Roosevelt, and he had this new idea of a New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt promised that the government could intervene to solve problems, but he also believed in balancing the budget. So he believed that the government could solve the problems by balancing the budget and providing for increased consumerism. One of the programs he did this with was the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. They would provide jobs to young men doing just about anything, just to make sure that they could get money so that they could become consumer spenders. Roosevelt also tried to stabilize the economy. He did this through banking. FDR saw at the time that banking was the basis of the problem. There wasn't enough banks giving out credit. So he set up a bank holiday where banks were shut down in order to establish just a period of calm, and then he created the Emergency Banking Relief Act. He also created the FDIC, which was insurance for people's money in banks. So if you put down a certain amount of money in banks, it would be insured. This allowed for people to put money into banks, again, so that they would not worry about them losing that. He also created the Glass-Steagall Act, which created a firewall between commercial banks and investment banks. So what's the point of this? Well, the idea would be if you put your money into a bank, you would know, if you decided to put it into a commercial bank, that it would not be used for highly risky types of stocks. If you want to do that, you can in investment banks, but by creating this firewall, you would have more safety and security for your money in banks. By doing this, people started to use the banks more. Banks could then lend out more credit. So some of Roosevelt's relief efforts. This goes back to what we talked about consumer spending, providing jobs to boost demand. And we talked about the CCC. There were some other programs that were very similar, like the PWA, Public Works Administration, where men worked on public works projects, or the WPA, Works Progress Administration, where people would work on roads and bridges and reservoirs and irrigation and sewers. The overall idea about this was to try and get people to do consumer spending again. Roosevelt, however, was criticized for not creating clear boundaries between the federal and state distinction, or what we call federalism in America. What about farming? Remember, farming was a real big problem with overproduction. So what Franklin Roosevelt tried to do here was to create 2 AAA programs. The first one, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, would actually destroy livestock and crops. Horrible idea, right? But the idea was if you create less supply, it would boost prices and solve overproduction. The Supreme Court knocked this down as overstepping the role of the federal government, and most people saw this as horrible because during a time period of the Great Depression, why would you destroy things that people wanted to be able to eat? So he then had passed the AAA number 2, Agricultural Adjustment Act number 2. Government would provide subsidies to farmers to lower production and plant crops that would not destroy the soil. The idea again was people farm less. That solves for overproduction. There's less supply. That means more money is brought into farmers. Another attempt was to solve elderly poverty. So at this time period, there was a man named Francis Townsend who called for an annual pension for the elderly. Roosevelt changed the details of this idea because it was a little bit on the more of the socialist side, so he changed this idea to Social Security. People would contribute to a government fund through a payroll tax, and after retirement, people could then pull that money out of the account. This became one of the legs of retirement funds, and it's known today as Social Security. So this brought up a counteracting or different economic philosophy from the one that we saw before with the classical economists, and this is known as Keynesianism. In 1937, the economy experienced another recession. The recession occurred within the Great Depression itself, and this became known as the Roosevelt recession. So why did this happen? Well, one argument was that in order to balance the budget, Roosevelt had lowered government spending. He had actually been advised by many of his advisors that he no longer needed to spend as much as he was spending, and he could therefore balance the budget. As soon as he attempted to do this, the economy went into another recession within the Great Depression. So after 1937, he ended up adopting the ideas of a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes argued against the classical economists that the government should not be completely laissez-faire. In fact, the government could actually be used as a tool to better strengthen capitalism. And it could do that by funding consumer spending. So how would it do this? Well, Keynes argued that during a recession, the government should spend more money, lower taxes, and if necessary, and he argued it was necessary, start to do what's called deficit spending, meaning the government should spend more money than it takes in. Now, most people, when they hear this, say, what a horrible idea, right? I mean, who would ever go out and spend more money than they take in? Well, think about it for just a minute. Did your parents buy their house right up with the amount of money that they have? Did they purchase a car directly off of the money that they have? Are you going to purchase your college education by putting all money down? Or do you take out loans, go into debt, and really invest in your future so that in the long run, you can actually not only pay off that debt, but make more money? Keynes argued that this is what the government ought to do. The government ought to spend more than it takes in as an investment. Sure, if the government just spends unwisely and doesn't allow society to become productive, that's bad debt. But if you go into debt because it allows you to be more productive in the long run, that can be good debt. And this was Keynes's point. The government could fund consumer spending and help to grow the economy. World War II. So from 1937 up until 1941, the economy did have some recovery, but and we saw unemployment go down, GDP growth rates went up, but the economy never fully recovered until after 1941. Well, why is this the case? Well, because we went into World War II, in which there was a massive amount of government funding of the war effort in industries. Most men were either fighting off in war. In fact, most of them were. A very small percentage remained working within factories. So they were either employed by the government through a war or employed in industries for the war, and a huge amount of women were now working in industries as well. For Keynesians, this was proof of what the government could do. If the government was allowed to do a massive amount of spending, they could push up consumer demand, consumer spending, and help the economy. For critics of Keynesianism, they argued this was only possible in a wartime economy. In fact, during the wartime economy, inflationary rates rose. There were rations on what people could buy, the amount that people could buy. Critics would argue that really the wartime economy was not a good example for the peacetime economy of the long run. So this is then going to get us into, after World War II, these two major camps, the Keynesians and the classical economists, who are going to come back, but they're going to come back in new forms. So we'll talk about that next time.